Good afternoon, everybody, and my name is Virginia Teehan. I'm Chief Executive of the Heritage Council, and it's a great privilege for me to chair this afternoon's session. We have an interesting lineup of speakers, all of whom are expert in their field, but we have a mix of a writer, a museum historian, and an academic, and also a representative from Dublin City University, Professor of Communications. Our theme for this session is altered perceptions of locality and civic culture. And I think that the discussion earlier, and in fact throughout the day, demonstrates, I think, a lot of the features that emerged over the past number of years during the COVID pandemic. Features which some of us who've perhaps been working for many years, as I have, in the world of cultural heritage and the arts, have observed ourselves and maybe discussed in small little groups, but we've never had the opportunity to articulate it, or maybe sometimes to see it in action. And I'm going to break my own rules by just beginning with a very quick anecdote of something that happened to me during the pandemic. And I was only in my job a couple of months when COVID hit, and it was my first time as CEO of a state agency, and without doubt it's challenging. And while we are a state agency and independent, I wouldn't fool myself. We're a small body, and I know we're on the edge of influence, even though perhaps people in this room think that the Heritage Council is important. There are much bigger players on the pitch. So when the pandemic hit, I was a little surprised that the Taoiseach's Office Information Unit was pulling us in all the time to regular briefings about what we could do. And what we did was, in the main, to develop programmes to support education. Our Heritage in Schools programme ran at full tilt, and we employed a lot of additional people to develop the content for RTE, to do the home education. We also directed a lot of work towards supporting, like the Arts Council, practitioners in heritage practice. And equally, the more interesting piece was the community piece, where people really found their sense of place, their connection with place, be they Irish or not originally from Ireland. And they wanted to explore their place. We ran programmes called Know Your 5K on social media, and it just snowballed and snowballed. So by 2021, when we were all exhausted and tired, and people in state agencies were making pitches to government for additional money, we were very lucky in that we doubled our budget to deliver programmes towards community. And in August 2021, I was in this beautiful site called Temple Breedy, an early Christian site overlooking Cork Harbour, with a wonderful group who had just formed within the previous 6 to 9 months to clean up their local graveyard. And this was, somewhat interesting given the nature of COVID. And here we were funding a graveyard, an early Christian graveyard, really interesting graves. Some of them, Gillian, would be interested to know, related to a previous pandemic, the Spanish flu. But we were doing a session with citizen scientists from the National Biodiversity Data Centre, one of our programmes, and we encourage a lot of public history, ground-led research and ground-led interest. And one of the features of the clearing of the graveyard was a nature-sensitive approach, whereby during the summertime we used sheep to clear off the vegetation, and during the wintertime we were changing over to a herd of goats that the Heritage Council had funded, these goats. And 2 of the goats escaped, and there was a group of about 40 people there. So I was helping the girl in charge herd the goats. And I heard this distinctive voice that I kind of recognised behind me saying, "I hope we're not paying a CEO to herd goats." And it was the Taoiseach. Quickly followed by the Minister for Public Expenditure, Michael McGrath. So you're there begging for money as a CEO and you're herding goats. And to use one of Dan's metaphors, you may as well be hung for a sheep as a lamb. And I said, well, Taoiseach, this is what we're doing with the taxpayers' money. And we turned around the corner and there was about 50 people involved in a community event. The Taoiseach and the Minister spent the afternoon with that group. About 6 months later, I got a message from the Taoiseach's office just to say, thanks, we now understand why what you do matters and why community matters in heritage. So I think if we do have a legacy from the pandemic, it is sometimes a shortening of the gap between the senior decision makers and the people on the ground, and sometimes those people in between, which are those small public agencies who are based upon a position of caring. And all of our speakers here today come from that position of caring and being passionate. And the first speaker is Professor Jane Moss from University College Dublin. Many of you, sorry, I beg your pardon, Sarah Moss. I'm dyslexic, so I get things backwards. Many of you will know Sarah through her work as a writer. I certainly do. Her excellent novels, Summer Water, Ghost Wall and Tidal Zone. And I know that Sarah is also working on a new book called The Fell. Sarah is Assistant Professor at University College Dublin, and she's going to speak on localism and the neighbourhood walk in lockdown. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I feel somewhat out of place here. I've rapidly rewritten my talk over the course of the last couple of hours in the wake of what we heard this morning. I'm a writer. I'm not even a humanities researcher. I'm certainly not a social science researcher. So I'm speaking as somebody with an artistic practice. I wouldn't say I was an expert in anything except perhaps the making of novels. I'm here partly because I published a novel set in lockdown as lockdown lifted. That's The Fell. Mine was the first book tour my publisher had organised in 2 years. And for most of the people who came to my readings and events, it was the first time they'd sat in a room with strangers in 2 years. Those people were relieved, eager to find their recent lives reflected or represented or challenged in artistic form. But there were other people who felt that to write and publish such a novel was in poor taste. It was too soon, some critics and readers said, for a COVID novel, far too soon. And I wondered, was a pandemic like a cheese or a Christmas pudding that had to be put away to mature in the cellar? And how would we know when it was time to make art? Would someone, some white male expert perhaps, ring a bell or raise a flag? I had expected to be challenged about my book, but I thought the controversial bit was putting a talking bird in a realist novel, not publishing a book about the events that had dominated everybody's lives for the last 2 years. So the answer to the question about what art is for in a pandemic is not obvious to me. I can tell you what art is not for. It's not therapy. It's not decoration. Art is not for making politics pretty. Art might console you, but that's not why we make it. There are chocolate bars and scented baths and yoga classes for that. Serious art can be provocation. It can be desolation. It can be terror. It can be resistance. It can be a howl of rage. Art insists on complexity. Art is not to make you feel better. That's why we have healthcare. Art might show you patterns you hadn't noticed. It can, I think, be care, but it's care for its subjects in its artistic forms, not for its audience. So what I offer you now, an abbreviated version of the thing I first wrote, is a piece of what we call creative non-fiction. We could talk about that another time. An essay on being in and out of place, in and out of community. It's not consolation. Let's call it provocation. The message said, new rules in force now. You must stay at home. Stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. In force, stay at home, in force. We were allowed out to exercise for 1 hour in 24. There was a police hotline, so your neighbours could report you if you outstayed your staying out. My ancestors howled at me. You should have left. You waited too long. You know what happens, don't you, when they close the schools and forbid you to leave the house? You know what comes next? Not here, I said. This is a different emergency. They all say that, said the ancestors. Have you learnt nothing? Have we not told you over and over again? You keep your papers and valuables on hand. You keep a line of sight on the exit route, and you leave before you're certain. If you wait until you know it's time to go, it's too late. And you waited, and it's too late. And now your children are under house arrest, and the government has your number. No, I said. I understand why you're jumpy, and I don't like the Tories either, but you're betting on the wrong horse. This one is plague, not war. You don't flee plague, it doesn't work. You pick up your bags and your babies and you get out, said the ancestors, and you didn't, and now you're trapped. We survived for you, and you won't survive for us. In most ways, I was right and the ancestors were wrong. But the ancestors in my head were not the only voices in England confusing COVID with the Second World War. The national disease of blitz nostalgia rampaged. There was not a war, no more than usual, but most people appeared to long for one. They sang the songs and put out the flags. If you didn't dream of living under aerial bombardment, you were in the wrong place. I was in the wrong place. I couldn't sleep. When the sun rose at 5:30, I got up and quietly left the house. I didn't think our neighbours were the hotline calling kind, but as the ancestors pointed out, you don't know who will hide you in the attic and who will call the hotline until they do. I left through the back gate, down the alley, out into the housing estate where cars slept in driveways and curtains were closed. I seemed to be heading towards the city rather than taking a morning stroll up the hill or to the woods. I crossed the industrial park, head down, quick step, and came to the railway line. I let my feet take me. You've already fucked up, said the ancestors. Your one job was to keep your children safe and you failed. Why don't you do everyone a favour? They'd be better without you. It seemed a good idea. There was a hole in the fence. I waited for a while, listening to the ancestral chorus, but the trains were all cancelled, and after a while I went home. I could not stay in the house for 23 hours. I could not, and I did. I paced and spun, spiralled. I bought a treadmill and ran miles in the garage, but I still couldn't sleep, couldn't rest, couldn't be still long enough to read or write. I understood that people were dying and that those deaths were more important than my distress. I understood that my disintegration was unimportant, inessential. Like everyone else, I said I was fine. We were all fine. None of us was in hospital or dying, and therefore there was nothing wrong. I thought then, and I think now, that the idea of gratitude is dangerous, regressive. If you should be glad of every breath and heartbeat, you have no business asking for a living wage or an end to police brutality or equality of access to healthcare and education. A definition of safety that begins and ends with biological function gives us less grace than the beasts of the field. I took to going out on my bike at 5 every morning, stealing an extra outing, touring country lanes that had been inaccessible because the fast roads from which they branched had been too dangerous to cycle. I passed the food bank where I volunteered until it was closed for lockdown. Citizenship is bigger than our immune systems. I passed the post-war housing estates where many of the clients of the food banks lived. I knew there were large families living in 2-bedroom apartments without balconies or outdoor space, and that many of those apartments had dangerous mold on the walls. At the food bank, we had lists for packing groceries for people who had no access to a fridge, cooker, or microwave. We gave them tins of beans and stew, knowing they would be eaten out of the can. Some of our clients had no access to a kettle, and now they had no access to the food bank either. I passed larger suburban houses where children's drawings of rainbows were displayed in the windows. Not, I had explained to my younger son, a gesture of support for the LGBTQ community, but a reference to the Old Testament. Storms end. There was the truths about Boris Johnson's government emerge. The story of Noah's Ark seems more relevant than we knew. The people in power had a party boat. I continued out into the countryside, an English pastoral known from art and literature, but still in reality exotic to someone whose England is northern, high, moor and mountain, dark satanic mills. The farmhouses and stone barns had all been done up, artfully converted into desirable residences for people who wouldn't live in the cities where they made their money. These people had orchards, tennis courts, pools, Shiny black cars parked on sweeping gravel drives, no doubt plenty of ensuite bathrooms. Their lawns stayed trim, hedges clipped. Perhaps they found time while working from home to look after their own gardens. They also had signs, not usually on the windows, which were well back from the road, but on gates and fences. Stay safe, stay home. Home is not safe for women. In the UK, 3 women a week are killed at home. Countless others hurt and abused and humiliated. Women are safer outside, but it was unpatriotic to talk about that. Rules in force. In force. Like Boris Johnson, we had illegal visitors. One of my son's school friends had told her conservative religious family that she was gay the week before we were told that we must stay at home. Stay safe. Mum, my son said, she's just messaged me. She's in the park and she has pills and vodka. We went to get her. We brought her back to our house. We fed her and listened to her and hugged her. Some of my son's friends, being young men of colour, were arrested for talking to each other on a park bench. In force. Rules in force. Most people stood on their doorsteps, those who had doorsteps, every Thursday, clapping and banging pans to show their appreciation for healthcare workers who were offered applause instead of fair pay and safe working conditions. It was unpatriotic to talk about that. You should just shut up and be grateful you could still breathe. Show some Blitz spirit. We moved to Ireland. If you're thinking of emigrating with teenagers and a high-maintenance cat during lockdown, especially to a country with an entrenched housing crisis, think hard. It was easier in Ireland. We couldn't go far, but we were near the sea and didn't need to go far. We could go out whenever we wanted and for as long as we wanted. There was no spying, no police hotlines, no fantasy of war. Outside was permitted. In Ireland, COVID was less virulent outside, which was also true in Scotland and Canada, but not France, Italy, or Spain. The national conversation in Ireland was less about police hotlines and COVIDiots, and more about what was essential, which seemed like a better conversation, even though the answers told you the exact demographic of the decision makers. Elite sport was essential, children's shoes weren't. Visiting graves was essential. It was essential to have the pubs open over Christmas, and then essential to close schools in January. But it was, I found, possible for a new arrival to make new friends, because most Irish people know at first or second hand what it's like to be an immigrant. Most Irish people have hospitable instincts, and also everyone was, or at least a lot of middle-aged women were, eager for novelty and entirely willing to walk up and down in howling wind and driving rain if that was the condition of escaping the family. The friendships I made as a new immigrant in lockdown continue to be the backbone of my Irish life. If competing ideas about what is essential, how citizenship is performed, about what constitutes heroism and idiocy reveal much about national life and identity, I want to conclude by bearing witness to the unlikely and enduring joy of those relationships. I want to state my gratitude not for the beating of my heart and the expansion of my lungs, which I think we may and must take for granted if we are to achieve anything else, but for the radical openness of companionship gladly given and gladly received at a time when we had learnt to fear other bodies. And I will add a cautionary note. As a parent and a teacher, I am afraid that that radical openness remains unfamiliar and frightening to many of the rising generation. I am afraid it might be too late for them to learn to offer and accept real-life welcome, an open door, a place at the table. And this seems to me the immigrant daughter of an immigrant father, the granddaughter and great-granddaughter of refugees, a terrible legacy of our learning to fear each other's presence.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that very vivid and honest representation of a difficult time. Our next speaker is Professor Jane Souter from Dublin City University, and Jane is Professor at the School of Communications and Director of DCU's Institute for Future Media, Democracy and Society. Jane, as many of you will know, certainly I know, has been involved in various research groups and has an oversight capacity around the Irish Citizens' Assembly and is a founder member of the group We Citizens, an important group which examines our ability to participate in civil society. I'd like you to welcome Jane. Thank you.
Is my presentation come up?
I'll get it there, sorry.
So now for something completely different. That was fantastic though, really powerful, really enjoyed that. I'm going to give you an unashamedly social science presentation on the possibility of citizens' assemblies and COVID lockdown. Basically, this started in the middle of March 2020. I was chatting with Lala Muradova, who was working with me at the time as a postdoc. She's now over in UPF in Barcelona. But there were a lot of people around the world, including probably most notably Arkan Fung from Harvard and Jenny Mansbridge, who were saying that the extensions of the lockdowns, the stay-at-home orders, and so on that we were seeing around the world, that really they should be subject to citizens' assemblies, that we shouldn't have this growing sort of technocracy, growing expertise, dominating policy making without citizens having an input to it. So we thought, right, well, that's very interesting. I've done a lot of work on citizens' assemblies and so on. There've been a lot of people talking, a kind of a growing literature about the problems of as societies become increasingly complicated, as policy making becomes more complicated, as people's expertise becomes more critical to policy making, that really there's a problem from a kind of a democratic legitimacy perspective. And then the other thing we were thinking about is, as well as this kind of problems of technocracy and the kind of democratic legitimacy of technocracy, was also, well, what happens when we also have a likelihood of growing authoritarian trends? You know, we have the phone things to report your neighbour. Now, luckily in Ireland, we didn't have that, but still this kind of wanting of, I think Fine Gael saw it in the beginning, you know, when the numbers went up dramatically from where they'd been in the last election, you know, when they were able to kind of give certainty. So in the beginning, when people are nervous about things, you know, they kind of want certainty. So we went, I wonder then, you know, there's these kind of competing dynamics about, you know, would people actually welcome citizens' input at that stage, at that beginning, at that uncertainty, at that moment when there was all this kind of fear. And at the same time, we were beginning to notice the beginnings of kind of misinformation campaigns. And you could see it, you know, particularly in the US about the, you know, sort of the origins of the virus and the blaming of China. So you've got this really sort of complex picture really messed up in the information environment where people aren't sure, where they're scared, and where others are worried about how much experts are actually involved. So why Citizens' Assembly? You know, why were Arkan Fung? Why was Jenny Mansbridge? Why were these other scholars writing in sort of letters in Nature and so on, Nature, Human Behaviour, arguing for these kind of citizens' institutions? And really, it's because of a growing body of research that says that, you know, these kind of mini publics, as citizens' assemblies are called, there can be citizens' assemblies, citizen juries, deliberative polls, there's loads of different kind of variations of the animal, if you like, but that they can affect the attitudes, the emotions, the beliefs of not only the 100 or 50 or however many people it is participating in them as citizens' assemblies, but also those in outside of society. So we saw this, for example, in the marriage equality referendum, where marriage equality went to the first constitutional convention. And there was a resounding vote in favour of having the referendum for marriage equality, and a vote in favour of recommending a yes for it. And then afterwards, when we did our research and we asked people, had you heard about the Citizen Assembly? What did you think? We found that those who had knew about the Citizen Assembly were much more likely to vote yes to marriage equality. And we found the same thing after the 8th referendum as well, where originally when the citizens in the 8th referendum had voted in favour of a repeal referendum and had recommended a yes to repeal, a lot of the commentariat and the political correspondence and so on said that these people weren't representative, that Middle Ireland wouldn't vote this way, that this wasn't possible for the politicians in the Dáil. But in fact, we found that the vote afterwards very closely mirrored the vote in the Citizen Assembly. So there's this kind of link between the mini public, those participating, and the kind of greater public, the rest of the people. And one of the assumptions is that because we can't all engage, now I think in crisis it's different, like everybody became a slight kind of, we're giving Philip a run for his money in terms of being able to do epidemiological models and, work out, where the virus was going and so on. And, we all knew it was airborne and we needed masks before the experts would tell us this. So yes, we were engaging because it was so important. But generally, we don't really have the time or the cognitive capacity often to engage with everything. And so we tend to trust others. And it very much comes back to what Roland was saying earlier. He was talking about the project that MRIA is running in UCD, Peritia, about trust and expertise. One of the really cool things that MRIA did in that Horizon 2020 project, she actually ran citizens' assemblies in 5 countries to see whether engaging citizens could actually increase trust in expertise and in science. And we've done some papers like that as well. So it's a matter of you're not just relying on the kind of the rational human, the truth-seeking, the Habermasian model of engagement. You're also looking at fellow citizens, people like you, not just demographically like you, but they might be people like you in terms of where they live or their experience or their beliefs and so on. And therefore it's easier to trust people from that. So both because citizens in the Citizen Assembly are kind of a microcosm of wider society, and also because we can feel that they're somehow like us, they're more similar. They're not experts like a lot of the people in this room, standing up like me, lecturing people, and therefore people feeling that, they're being somehow treated in a paternalistic manner or whatever. And there's also kind of research that shows that engagement in kind of small groups like that and listening about it can actually make people more reflective. So it gives you an opportunity to actually think, to hear about the sort of storytelling. So just like the story we heard just now, so we're listening to that, we're listening to the story, and suddenly we're actually picturing going through those estates. We're thinking about them. We're thinking about the people who were living in those apartments, the people who didn't have the opportunities that the people in the large houses had. And so these kind of institutions where you bring people together who aren't self-selected from different walks of life actually enables people to hear stories from other people. So in that way, a lot of the research that Lala in particular, but others have done, shows that they're reflexivity enhancing institutions. So they enhance empathy and knowledge, and we've got lots of different ideas about this. So we had these first hypotheses that we thought, okay, maybe hearing that citizens had talked about this, maybe this is going to help people with kind of lockdown and kind of go, okay, I am willing to, engage with this kind of lockdown. I am willing to do another 4 weeks of it, I think was what we had in our experiment. And we thought that maybe there would be the impact of crisis. But then we thought, as I was saying in the beginning, about crisis and how different it is, and the kind of whole literature on crises and how crises kind of affect people. And I think this is part of the sort of the learnings that we need to think about now. And like this conference, I think, is an amazing kind of step on the journey where we can start to think about there will be more crises. It might not be another pandemic, but there might be some absolute climate crises. There might be some other crises, an unknown that we don't know about. So how are we actually going to bring things together? At what point do we learn? And so I'll come back to that. But crises, whether they're wars or pandemics, natural financial disasters, 2008 was a crisis for so many people. We heard today about the number of suicides that, the funeral director was dealing with. 2008 was the same in the financial crisis. There was, a spike in suicide. So all sorts of crises can have these impacts on people because they cause insecurity and uncertainty and fear. So COVID was very much a crisis. And, we looked at the kind of the three things that really we think from our kind of review of the literature really led to the kind of crisis assessment. So the first was the kind of the immediacy of it. So, the government, Leo Varadkar and that first late show on the Friday night before Paddy's Day, that was a really kind of immediate thing. We were all sort of listening about it, and it really increases the salience of it. There's also crises when, if you read the great book that Hugh O'Connell and Jack Horgan-Jones did about decision making in the pandemic, you could see that there were people like a colleague, Kevin Cunningham, were warning about the crisis in advance when it was still in China and coming into Italy. But policymakers here weren't really dealing with it because it wasn't actually proximate enough. It didn't actually become proximate enough until we saw the coffins and piling up in Bergamo. So when things become close, then they become more scary. You don't really think about them when they're further away. So that kind of proximity, the extent that it's close, really can provoke these kind of authoritarian preferences among the public. And I think this is something that we have to be really kind of concerned about in crisis, and we have to be aware that this is what happens. So on the one hand, you have growing expectocracy, growing technocracy, growing numbers of kind of anti-democratic, if you like, people who aren't elected, essentially telling us how we should behave. And of course, for the good, saving many lives. But nonetheless, we have to think about the other side of it. And at the same time, we have a citizenry who are scared because they're in a crisis situation and therefore have authoritarian preferences. So we thought, well, perhaps when we do this research, what we'll actually find that, hearing that citizens are involved, that's going to stress people out because that's going to delay decision-making. That's going to reduce the kind of impact of it and so on. And that probably this will make a difference to, obviously, everybody is different in terms of their level of their kind of authoritarian and centralized preferences, their levels of fear in the face of a crisis. So we designed this cross-national experiment in the UK and Ireland and America, where we designed these little vignettes like this. They were just like a news thing that you might get on Facebook. And we said, the government has decided to extend the lockdown by another 4 weeks following advice from a citizen assembly, or following advice from a parliamentary committee, or following the advice of the experts, or else just in the control condition that, the government has just decided to extend the lockdown. And the first of these was actually we ran it in April 2020. So it was still at the beginning of the pandemic. So people were still scared, it was uncertain, the science was uncertain, the experts were uncertain, it was an intense moment in it. But what we found, and excuse the graphs, okay, like I know, but you'll just live with me. Basically, what we found is that overall, if we told people that we'd actually taken the time out to listen to citizens at that point, we were going to make them less likely to be able to live with lockdown. So hearing that a citizen assembly being involved actually worked the opposite way to the way a lot of philosophers had thought that it would work. So we thought that was really interesting. And the main thing it was moderated by was actually authoritarian preferences. So if people had low trust in citizens' assemblies, so we found that, of course, especially people had higher trust in Ireland in citizens' assemblies than they did in America, because no doubt we've had citizens' assemblies, but still in Ireland, those with low levels of trust in citizens' assembly, they actually became less likely to be willing to live with a lockdown if it had been part of a citizen assembly, or indeed part of a parliamentary committee. They didn't want any extra institutions or roadblocks put in the way between the decision-making and what they were being told to do. They wanted the immediacy, they wanted to be told straight away what to do. And that appears what seems to make them feel safe. It was really strongly moderated by authoritarian attitudes. So those who had more authoritarian attitudes, who really felt, I want to be told what to do, it's important that the government tells us immediately, were more likely to be affected by this. So really the best kind of predictor we could find of people being willing to live with more lockdown measures was actually their authoritarian attitudes in time of crisis. Now, I have to stress that obviously your authoritarian attitudes in times of crisis and your authoritarian attitudes at a time of non-crisis are two very different things. But that's what we found. And we found the more people had strong government preferences, so the more they really wanted a strong government. And that's where we can look to, like there was moves, we could see this in different surveys among younger people, especially even thinking that China had done really well in the pandemic, keeping people really safe. There was kind of a fall off in people who were in favor of liberal democracy in a time of crisis. And then threat perceptions. So the more scared they were, the more they could see a threat, the more willing they were to do this. And then there was also interpersonal trust in politicians, gender. Men were less likely to want to adhere to the measures. But the mini-publics, the citizens' assemblies, wouldn't work unless for specific groups of people who trusted them and so on. But for those who didn't trust them, they actually went back the other way. So I think for us, the really interesting thing is not that we shouldn't consult citizens about this, but that the first moment of a crisis is not the time to do it because people are too scared to think about it. So the time to do it is probably now. It's probably in this kind of venue. So we've been hearing today the stories from all sorts of different people from different walks of life. And I think the time now is to think about how should Ireland prepare for the next crisis, whatever type of crisis it is. To what extent should we be listening to citizens? Should we have different groups? What kind of perspectives do we need? Where's the humanities? Where's the arts? Let's listen to the social science. Let's look at the behavioural ones. Let's think about the government's emergency response group. What kind of expertise should be on that? Should right now we be looking at the membership of that emergency response? Should we be thinking about, who should be on it? Should there be completely random people on it, as well as people from the humanities, the arts, the social sciences? So I think now, when people aren't scared, is the time to plan and to really think about how we can do better next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane, for that very important reflection on the role of the collective voice in how we make decisions. I'd like to welcome Gillian O'Brien. Gillian is Professor at Liverpool John Moores University, and she's a reader in modern history there. She's author, as some of you may know, of The Darkness Echoing, Exploring Ireland's Places of Famine, Death and Rebellion, and Blood Runs Green, the murder that transfixed the Gilded Age in Chicago. I also know Gillian through my own work and our joint work on museum and cultural studies in Ireland, and she's a very fine colleague and a welcome contributor to this discussion. Gillian.
Thanks, Virginia, and thanks for the invitation to speak here today. I feel I got the short straw following on from those two papers. When the pandemic hit, I was completing The Darkness Echoing, a book about Irish museums, galleries and heritage sites and how they reflect on the past, predominantly about Ireland's miserable past, of which there is a lot. But I had to move rapidly from thinking about how the present sees the past to considering how the future might see our present, which was very confusing. The rallying of communities as part of the All in It Together that Orla mentioned earlier, and that was in many ways heartwarming, but the pandemic was also a trigger in some ways for civil unrest, whether that was COVID deniers, anti-mask or anti-vax protests. Everyone's experience was individual, and that seems really obvious saying it now, but I think it's something we often iron out when dealing with the past at a remove of years, centuries, or millennia. When we talk about plague or famine or war, or as Ida mentioned earlier, the Spanish flu pandemic of the early 20th century, we often tie them up in neater parcels than we should, or we ignore them altogether. Perhaps the Blitz spirit that Sarah just mentioned, that's so often referred to in Britain, never really existed. There is much to think about and reflect on as an individual and for the heritage and cultural sectors. And I think that speaks to something Philip mentioned earlier about what really happened and how did we experience it. And I think it's something that the cultural and artistic sectors and heritage sectors need to think about as well. We talked earlier about how everything went online and how there were sort of viral moments. I had a viral moment myself during the pandemic when a single tweet, this one, in a virtual class went viral in February 2021 when Brenda Malone, who absolutely hates this photograph of her, who's curator at the National Museum, showed a pair of slippers to my MA class in Liverpool. The slippers captured the public imagination. They're a pair of size 9, bright blue wool slippers with a wolf's head stitched on the toe caps. The colour is as vivid as it was a century ago. I think they're beautiful. They're my favourite things in the National Museum. But what makes them particularly noteworthy is that they belonged to Michael Collins. The slippers were donated to the National Museum by Bridget O'Connor. Collins had been a regular guest at the home she shared with her husband, Bat O'Connor, and their children in Donnybrook, and he kept the slippers for when he stayed there. So why did these go viral? I woke the following morning to several thousand notifications, and I thought, oh God, we're in all sorts of trouble because people will think we're mocking Collins or something. But that wasn't the case at all. And it may be that these went viral because at the time, most of us had little need to ever take off our own slippers, for there was almost nowhere to go. And it generated huge debate about whether it was a fox or a wolf on the slippers, and the media took hold of this story. So for the next 10 days or so, you have Brenda on Clareburn Live, we were on RT Radio, we were dealing with media requests from across the world to talk about the slippers. And it wasn't just that. It was people put all sorts of things online. So Michael Collins, as we would normally see him, but wearing his slippers. Hairy Baby, who do t-shirts, made a wolf t-shirt, which of course I own. We had people who actually made copies of these slippers themselves. There was all sorts of things. And it was sort of remarkable. There was this sort of community around the Michael Collins slippers. My favourite of all of these, and I've always wanted to use this as a slide and never had an opportunity, was a photo of Bernie Sanders at the Joe Biden inauguration, which was superimposed into the Royal Irish Academy Library. The slippers, having never been on public display, will go on public display in the National Museum next year, which I'm very pleased about. But the slippers did tap into an interest in the ordinary. Using social media, the National Museum began collecting the now and was sent material including Stay Home and Stay Safe art, a flag in Irish thanking the HSE staff, Irish distillery bottles showing the change in the use of alcohol being made into hand sanitizer instead of gin, masks of all types. There was, I think, a growing awareness that museums aren't just about famous people or the long dead. I'm going to do something I never do, which is show some graphs. I hate a graph, but it's quite useful here. These are an analysis from Fáilte Ireland of annual visitor attractions between 2019 and 2021. If you take 2019 as 100%, you can see the drop-off there in 2020, a huge drop-off and a slight rise, but it's still a massive drop-off in 2021. But the figures that I am particularly concerned about are the ones in the second graph. And you may not be able to see it there, but there's historic sites, museums and galleries, and visitors and heritage centres, which are just from the end going backwards. And they saw the biggest drop-off. And that's because, for the most part, they're indoors. So the overall drop in 2020 was down 60%. But that includes things like Botanic Gardens, which remained open for much of the time. So it actually skews the figures. So far fewer museums and others had visitors. These are more specific figures, and I've taken sort of a random selection from the figures that I have. We don't have the 22 figures for every site. These are a mix of indoor and outdoor attractions, and you can see the National Botanic Gardens, second from the bottom there, had huge figures still through the pandemic of over 600,000. And when things reopened and you had options to go other places that you couldn't have gone to for the best part of 18 months, their figures drop. And you can see there that the National Museum Collins Barracks, it bounces back very effectively from the pandemic to kind of slightly higher than pre-pandemic numbers. Kilmainham Jail has remained somewhat lower because they've still been restricting the size of the tour groups that can go around. But I want to bring your attention to one site there that you probably won't have heard of or been to. And my real concern is with smaller sites, and such as the Famine Warhouse, which is in Ballingarry, County Tipperary. And it's the site of the 1848 Young Ireland Rebellion, which many of you may be more familiar with as the Battle of Widow McCormick's Cabbage Patch. And you can essentially see Widow McCormick's Cabbage Patch. It never has had very many visitors. So it's at 1,300 in 2019, down to 90 and back up to 600. But it's these sort of sites. Now, this is an OPW site, but it does represent many other sites in the country. And those sites are small sites, and that the charts and the figures don't show. A significant part of cultural heritage offerings in Ireland is driven by the community and voluntary sector. And there is now a very noticeable gap in terms of innovation between these and salaried organisations. Obviously, not having a financial cushion was a major factor, but also the age profile of volunteers has meant that many of them have decided not to return to their volunteer roles post-COVID. And this loss is extremely difficult to recover from. For example, the Tullaherrin Folk Museum in County Kilkenny is closing after 40 years because of the pandemic. I know of another small volunteer-led museum that closed, and the collection, built up over half a century, was given to one individual who has no plans to make it publicly accessible. And there is also a related issue. Active retirement and third age groups have not returned to visit museums or galleries in the same way as school groups and others have. And that is a considerable concern. At a time when opinion is often given equal weight to expertise, it is ever more important that there are trustworthy sources of information. And it's interesting to see in this US survey that museums and historic sites are right at the top of trust placed to give an accurate account of history. And so it was very important that when doors of museums were shut, it was vital that we kept the online windows open. These are figures from the network of European museums organisations. 600 museum professionals across 48 countries, including Ireland, responded to this survey on the impact of COVID. Since reopening, much of the focus has been on a return to normal working practice, but there have been changes in audience behaviour and cultural consumption. An additional layer has been added: online activity and digital material. Audiences have, as you can see in this graph here, increasing interest in everything, except whatever special newsletters are. Nobody wants any more of those, apparently. But they are most interested in social media and video content, both expensive and time-consuming for every site that uses them. In the pie chart on the right-hand side, you can see that 50% of sites have seen interest in online offerings remain the same since the COVID spike or continue to increase. I'm slightly concerned about the 10% who still don't track online engagement after the full of the pandemic. During COVID, museums had to pivot very quickly to offering digital content. And given anyone who works in the sector will know how slowly things normally happen, this was quite remarkable. For some, that was easier than others. In the Irish Museums Association survey of 2016, 97% of those who responded had a website, but at the time, only 40% had a digital strategy. And having a digital strategy is more and more important, because there are pros and cons of the online world. Clearly, accessibility and increased reach is important. Online is great for those who cannot get to a site for whatever reason. And some sites are increasingly using subtitles and Irish Sign Language as part of what's on offer online. Seamus Heaney, listen now again, part of the National Library, ran 232 online events between April 2020 and April 2021. That averages at more than 4.5 a week over the course of a year that they turned around almost immediately when the pandemic began. And they're not the only ones who are doing that, but that is remarkable with a really small team. One of those who wrote to them during the pandemic, writing from Massachusetts in October 2020, wrote, "Online access to all those marvellous Heaney presentations has been such a source of joy, of learning, and of consolation in a world turned upside down. I hope the National Library will be able to continue these virtual sessions even after the pandemic ends. You and your colleagues are doing a great service to poetry lovers near and very far away." And it was comments like that, I think, that kept a lot of people working in those sectors going during that time, whether it was chasing goats or otherwise. And they are still running online events, but just not as many. Many sites have created a bank of activities where online material can be used as supplementary to in-person visits. For example, some museums created content specifically aimed at junior cycle and leaving cert students, which have a shelf life of at least a few years as a classroom resource, or recording events like today, though I suspect what I'm saying will be out of date very rapidly. Much more effort is being put into social media than before the pandemic. And this reaches another very significant audience and works well as a way to tell stories or share objects that might not work in an exhibition context. Objects aren't being collected just because they would work well on social media, but it is something people are now conscious of. But you must be prepared to encounter hostile responses, especially around topics such as decolonisation or slavery. Yesterday, Kilmainham Jail posted about Pride Month queer history tours, and the replies to that tweet were horrific, but sadly not shocking. So it is something that people need to be very conscious of. UNESCO and the Department of Culture and Tourism in Abu Dhabi published a report late last year about resilience, recovery and revival in culture. And I just want to use their kind of headings here as a way to reflect a little on what's happened or is happening in the Irish situation. There is or has been enhanced emphasis on the culture sector's social values. COVID-19 brought around greater recognition of the value of culture, where numerous studies have concluded that the consumption of cultural content or participation in cultural activities has a positive impact on mental health. The importance of involvement in local and national initiatives. For example, with festivals like Bealtaine Festival or School Resources or many local festivals dotted around the country, Pride Month or Heritage Week. All of these were happening pre-COVID, but they are now very often with closer ties to many museums and galleries. Increasingly, it seems that there is space for cultural and heritage practitioners to play a significant role in shaping public conversations and driving positive change in society. And there are ongoing discussions taking place about how museums can effectively act as advocates, navigate external pressures, and lead with integrity in challenging times. For growing awareness of the importance of ensuring the livelihoods of artists and cultural professionals. And this, I think, was touched on a little in the previous panel. A large percentage of heritage and cultural sector jobs are informal, part-time, self-employed, or unpaid. The UNESCO report argues that new frameworks for these precarious workers are needed, particularly in light of people losing their entire incomes at the start of the pandemic and how, quickly people had to scramble to find ways of paying people. Reopening was great, but expectations and reality are often at a variance. Because funding, resources hasn't increased alongside kind of what people are being expected to do. Because during COVID, museums and heritage sites had to find new ways of delivering content, developing new policies and procedures. They were all a huge amount of additional work. With reopening, much of that COVID work is still there in addition to the in-person work. And it's challenging trying to juggle both on-site and online, and many staff are exhausted and many are leaving the sector. The rise of collaboration and increased sectoral solidarity. I really hate the way these reports are written. Collaboration and knowledge exchange are very important. The pandemic put a stop to the exchange visits or in-person conferences, but new relationships developed and thrived, very often because the sector was forced to look within itself during the pandemic. Alliances have developed between organisations that might previously have seen each other as competitors. And there are a growing number of cross-sectoral collaborations. For example, Nanonagle Place and the Cork Migrant Centre in Cork, or Midland Science has a partnership with the National Museum. Many of these relationships which have been forged in the pandemic will continue, and many of them bring with them new audiences, and which are non-traditional audiences in museums, galleries and heritage sites. There has certainly been an accelerated adoption of digital practices and techniques. And there is an increased expectation for online exhibition content. But there are also issues with expense, connectivity, and expertise. With new forms of creation, production, distribution, dissemination, and access to culture and heritage, there needs to be thought about protecting content and protecting audiences and the content creators. For example, if you look at what happened with Twitter. Adaptation of strategic, operational and business models and practices across the value chain. Word sentence like that. Anyway, this is a quote from the report. Many organisations that depend heavily on international tourism, such as iconic cultural sites, have pivoted to local visitors and communities to sustain their operations. Innovative approaches bring new ways to produce and distribute cultural content, as well as opportunities to broaden market potential and audience reach, sometimes by staying closer to home. They also point towards opportunities for a greener future, thanks to the emergence of sustainable cultural tourism practices. And this, I think, speaks to what Virginia mentioned about communities. It's important for Ireland. We need to know who the audiences are, who's going to these sites. Are they customers, consumers, communities, partners, tourists, and whether they're local or international? It feels like the period of closures and absences has accelerated the move towards a more fully rounded audience-focused approach and a wider internal and external consideration of why museums exist. The growing awareness of audiences have highlighted issues around diversity and inclusion, both staff and visitor. All communities need to feel engaged and represented by the cultural sector. In my experience visiting museums across Ireland pre-COVID, there were large gaps in representation, very little on the traveller community, very little on immigrants. And there are 2 points I want to make just at the end. One about funding. Discussion about audience raises concerns about the Irish funding model. There is a large drive to bolster tourism from abroad. This existed before, but has been increased, for good or ill, post-pandemic. This is partly a result of the amalgamation of tourism and culture under one department, while heritage is under another. This contrasts highly with the messaging from Northern Ireland, where arts and culture is part of the Department for Communities. Now, there's lots that could be said about Northern Ireland and its lack thereof of government or others. But in this instance, I think arts and culture and communities is a good fit and is something that we should consider here. For all of the benefits of being online, nothing beats the in-person experience. In one museum, I was overtaken by a young boy aged about 5, who, as he dashed past me towards whatever had caught his attention, shouted back to his mother, "This is the best day ever." I love what I call seeking the small, peering in cases trying to find the smallest object, the most incongruous, the most moving, or the funniest. And I think that's the thing about museums, is that there's always a surprise. The object or painting that lingers long in your memory afterwards is often something unheralded, not usually the big headline piece that initially lures you in. During the pandemic, museums were curtailed in the scale of what they could do in terms of exhibitions and began to look at doing smaller displays. Many have kept doing this after lockdown and created spaces to consider different stories, often centred on a few objects, rather than always doing a full exhibition. This allows smaller stories, often the most interesting, or quieter objects to take centre stage. There is huge value in this, especially if you want repeat visitors. And finally, just to sum up, the pandemic has allowed for a reappraisal of many things, including what museums and other cultural and heritage sites stand for. They have never been neutral. They have certainly been didactic, telling the visitor things, assuming that they know best. But that is changing. Museums and heritage sites have been actively reflecting on and considering how they see themselves and are seen in relation to wider societal issues and the significant soft power they can exercise. There may be choppy waters ahead as sites develop strategies for addressing conflicts between museum values and stakeholder views, amplifying marginalised voices and acknowledging historical complicity. Museums should not be solo players. They are not impermeable to the ebb and flow that they are part of. The embedding of community involvement, the commitment to open-ended conversations, the admission that interpretation can change over time is hugely positive. In a post-pandemic, hopefully, in a post-pandemic world, there is an opportunity to shape a future where heritage and cultural sites influence, lead and drive positive change alongside the communities they are part of. Thank you.
Thank you, Gillian, for that very interesting discussion around how the cultural heritage sector, in particular the museum sector, is adapting to its changed circumstances. We now have some time, about 15 minutes or so, for questions. So I'd just like, if anybody has a question, yes, we have a question back here. This lady down here. Could you please?
Yeah. So my question is to Jane Suter. You talked about how we can look at or review what the citizens' opinion of the pandemic really is. Is there any criteria that you think that we need to review this from like the citizens' perspective?
Well, I think a lot of the conversation today provides a really good starting point. But I think it's important that we think about how it actually did impact families, how different people reacted, what we think we should do in different types of future crises. Obviously, we don't know what they are, but what are the broad principles we'd like? You know, personally, one of my things was, and no offence to you, Philip, but we had, I think, 8 men telling us what was going to happen at all points. You know, all of the senior decision makers were that. Is that what we want in our next crisis? Would we actually like younger voices in? Would we like people who maybe weren't born on the island to be part of it? Would we like women to be part of it? Would we like people from arts and culture? So how do we actually, I think what we need to do is think about what are the broad kind of parameters of decision-making we'd like in our next crises? Because the only thing we know is there's bound to be one. We've had 2 in the last 15 years. Who knows, it probably won't be 15 years until the next one. So I think that's the really important thing is, who should be involved? How will we make decisions? How do we include people? And now's the time to do it when we're not actually in crises. Because Ireland is really good at crisis management. But I think we're less good at long-term planning. And so I would like us to kind of put in some long-term planning that actually includes voices from across society and think about the impacts of decision-making and the type of people who make decisions before the next crisis.
Dan has a question over here to the right.
Thank you again for all the discussions. I wanted to ask her a question if I could. I really enjoyed your contribution. I think it was very challenging and important. I know of a lot of people, and some writers, in fact, who declared that they would, in a Pepysian vein, keep a diary and then quickly abandoned doing so. That seems like a medium that is suitable to the pandemic, because we don't know where we are other than in the present moment, even of the day, and we don't know what's coming and what's going to happen. Is that something you entertained, keeping a diary? Have you heard of others, writers or otherwise, who felt that that was enabling, and if people didn't keep with it, why not?
I don't think I know of anybody who took to keeping a diary during lockdown who wasn't already keeping one. I'm still slightly mystified by this idea that you can't or shouldn't write about something because it's happening. I mean, it seems to me that that's exactly why you can and should write about it. I see that it's a widely held view that we talk about in relation to film, that somehow we need to wait. But I'm not sure what we're waiting for or how we'll know when the waiting is over.
Any further comments or reflections? Yes, Sylvia, over here, please.
Just in relation to keeping a diary, I had this little personal project of my own during COVID, which I want to kind of have as a time capsule. I have friends and family from fairly much around the world, and I asked about 20 of them to write a letter to their grandchild, talking about their experience of now. About quite a few of them refused, actually, which was kind of interesting in itself. But I'll probably have about 15 of them now that I'm just going to keep for some time in the future. And people just wrote about their own experiences. I'm aware that it was a very kind of personal group, so it wasn't as diverse as it could have been. But I thought it just worth mentioning.
Thank you. I think that's a very interesting perspective around how we as a society make a conscious effort to record what we're experiencing. And frequently in my world and the world of this panel, we're probably looking at how we can recapture and represent the past, like past events. And there's a discussion at the moment around how we might commemorate those women who were in mother and baby homes and what that should look like and what does trauma look like. So a question I would have for the panel is, how in 100 years would they see a group in this room discussing what a commemoration of this time would look like? Each one of you.
Fine, look at me. Partly, I'm not sure there are going to be groups in 100 years, because if we don't do something rapidly about climate change,
True.
There are not going to be people assembling with microphones and electric lights and buildings going on outside. I also suspect that in 100 years, COVID is going to look like very small beer indeed.
Mm. Mm-hmm. And Gillian, to share the microphone, break the rules. Philip, don't look.
Post-COVID. I tend to agree. I think that this might be quite small. It'll be one of the small things I'd find in a museum. I think that there will be bigger fish to fry, which is a bit depressing.
Yeah.
I hope we have an enormous museum about it, which would mean that we didn't have anything else to talk about.
Okay. And then what do you?
Yeah, no, I think it's the same. I think, it's just a precursor of like where the crises are. And we know that, climate breakdown is here and it's coming. We feel it less here than in other countries. But, Quebec is on fire. Yeah, I don't think it's going to be the thing.
That's interesting because, one thing I observed just in my own role was, and perhaps maybe because of the wider context of the decade of centenaries, for example, people had a greater understanding, I felt, in COVID of the impact of the Spanish flu than perhaps may have been the case otherwise. They were aware more, we were more aware as a society how medical-driven events can really cause a big rift in particularly the disadvantaged and their experience of huge, big, uncontrollable events which are inexplicable at times. And I suppose what's happening with the climate is another manifestation of that, the inexplicable. Are there any other reflections? Luke?
Yeah, just picking up on the locality in the theme here. There's an interesting dichotomy. On the one hand, we all discovered, I think, interesting things within a few kilometers of our houses, which we didn't even know about. Certainly, I remember my wife saying, I've discovered this little park that I never knew existed. And because we were all desperately trying to find something close by which we could walk to. Yeah. So on the one hand, we discovered much more about our local environment, but on the other, we were all forced online. And it was quite interesting, just picking up on the bit about the museums going online. In this academy, we got much bigger participation in the discourses, in the talks, in the various events, because they were online. And so we had people participating, actually not just from Ireland, but from all around the world. And in the academic community, online seminars are now the common way of doing it, because we've discovered they're actually better, easier, more accessible, more inclusive, and far cheaper. Mm-hmm. So there are some benefits coming out of this. And if I can make one final remark, somebody said earlier there are no superheroes here. Well, there is actually one superhero, which is blue skies research. We had 20 or 30 years of underfunded, underappreciated research on what seemed to be a very abstruse thing, messenger RNA. Suddenly, it turns out that we are able to produce vaccines at an incredible speed. And the other thing that has to be said is half those vaccines didn't work. But fortunately, enough of them did. We are incredibly lucky, actually, that the vaccine production could be ramped up swiftly. There are big problems with the way the pharmaceutical industry is controlling that. But basic science actually came to the rescue. And there was a superhero in the room, and it was blue skies research. That's for you, Philip.
Yes, I think a lot of people appreciated that, and we would hope that that too would be transferred into the challenges which the climate crisis is now presenting, and that sense of collaboration. I mentioned in my introductory remarks how surprising it was for me as somebody working in kind of the broad public service to be engaging with a range of government departments, and we were all working with one objective: to support Ireland to find its way through this society or through this crisis. And no matter what part you played, you approached your work. And I think people did with a heart and a half, with a view to helping everyone. Are there any further comments? Yes, we've one here.
Hello, I'm Mark Scully. I'm a lecturer in psychology at Mary Immaculate College. A comment that I promise, turn into a question about audiences, specifically coming off Gillian's talk. But I just need to preface this by a little bit of a narrative that explains how I live in Blarney. So Blarney Castle was within my 2K during lockdown. What was interesting about living within 2K of Blarney Castle was the locals have never been the target audience for Blarney Castle, and the international audience has always been the target audience. And suddenly the locals became very much the target audience for Blarney Castle because nobody else could travel there. So there was this very odd moment of the locals almost retaking the castle, and you'd walk around the grounds, you'd see all your neighbours, but you'd know from the interpretative signs that this wasn't meant for you. This was meant for people that were receptive to some of the more flowery language and mythology around Blarney. So I'm just wondering, in literally Blarney in the Irish-American sense rather than the place name. So I'm just wondering, in terms of, can we see any longer legacies of that in terms of heritage sites, museums, of rapidly having to change audience and then maybe flipping back to a more international audience again, as Blarney Castle has done? That may be a difficult question to answer, Gillian, but...
It's very interesting you mentioned Blarney, because I went there for that very reason about 2 weeks ago, having never been to Blarney before because I'm not the target audience. But you're absolutely right. And in fact, you're the second person who mentioned this sort of change over time and how all the signage is definitely not aimed at local or even an Irish audience. And I think that's something that our heritage and tourism sectors have to really consider. I think I mentioned that the different departments that have oversight of heritage and tourism and all of that. I think one of the big issues we have here is that so much of the funding for tourism sites is bound up with the Irish Tourist Board or Fáilte Ireland, and a lot of their remit is about getting people in, the one-time visitor. And I think it's slightly problematic, or I think it's hugely problematic, that we have that funding tied to a tourism agency. Because they have responsibility for Ireland's ancient East, even though it goes as far west as Cove, which I find problematic too, or the Wild Atlantic Way. And there is a certain sameness and a certain branding about those, which doesn't really work for a local visitor. It's very much aimed at the external visitor. And I think that's something that we really need to deal with, is taking the funding and taking it away from the tourist board, essentially, and putting it into an arts, heritage, and cultural package, so that local audiences are much more likely to find something in it for them.
I might just comment on that as well. There's a huge gap in Ireland between privately owned heritage and public ownership, and Blarney Castle is privately owned. So the management of the site is completely within the control of the owner. And equally with privately owned sites, obviously there's a need to generate revenue. And the biggest revenue for Blarney is from the American tourist. And Gillian is very right, because there is a spillover of the need, as is in the case of so many private owners, to operate commercially and attract revenue. And then our public sites, of which there are many, and that it's the same philosophy that applies. And what's missing is what has grown particularly strongly during the pandemic is the sense of societal ownership of our place, of that group that, Michael McGrath and Micheál Martin happened upon. They were attending a funeral at the modern graveyard. I was in the old graveyard, and they just came face to face with us. But this was the public owning their heritage and enjoying and experiencing it. And too often, heritage is understood not for its own value, its own integrity, but for its potential commercial value to promote Ireland internationally. And, I think maybe I would like to think that there's a growing awareness that we as citizens individually, through our engagement with, say, our literary heritage or our place or the objects in museums and galleries, that we are claiming an ownership in a more confident way than perhaps we have done in the past. We have allowed others manage it. And the growth of, we see this particularly in the Heritage Council because our budgets have grown significantly and we now provide a number of millions, maybe about 5 million annually, to community groups to engage and initiate community-led heritage projects. And that's growing. And it's growing particularly with those who are new to Ireland, who are finding themselves, say, in the Midlands, and they're finding the boglands, and they appreciate them. And their sense of enthusiasm and joy in their place is contagious. And the local people are almost rediscovering where they're from. As local people, as you mentioned, Luke, you rediscovered your area. We had a Know Your 5K project, which was an online project, and people uploaded their favourite heritage assets in their 5K. And every 2 days, the system crashed because there was so much engagement. So that is a yardstick of interest and an indicator of the need to change from what Gillian describes, and I also experience is an approach which is commercially driven. And I think also it speaks to the point around the citizens' assembly and the public voice and the democratic right to us as citizens to express our values and what is important, and how we cannot disconnect our values and allow others to make decisions about our actions, that these are all interconnected. And there is a social contract between the government and us as citizens around how we manage where we live. And perhaps there needs to be a greater engagement with that. It was wonderful to see the Citizens' Assembly on Biodiversity. It's one that obviously through my work I'm closest to because we've a big role in protection of biodiversity. But it would be welcome to see a greater articulation of the societal voice in anticipating how we will respond to these crises which are emerging. So are there any other comments? I know we've had a long day. Just one back here. Okay. Yeah.
Just on foot of that, I totally agree with the view, and I think that connects to this morning, that I think we lost Stuart Hall during the recently, and he said that we have to, as a society, consider that there are things that should not be privatised and that should not be financialised. And I think that one of the things that was also said just now by Gillian was about the fact that we can expect this again. And I suppose as a cultural studies academic, and I'm sad to say that my institute has decided to axe cultural studies from its programme. I think that's ideological, but that's what they've decided. But as a cultural studies academic, what I found the students are most interested in is world systems analysis. That one of the things that the pandemic showed to the students was that this is a system and that it has failure and crisis built into it, and that the current conjuncture, as Stuart Hall would put it, is something that needs to be interrupted. I think there has been, I think there's a lot of use of the word collaborative. I would like to get back to the word collective. I think that there was a wonderful talk this morning on the funerals, and I think that that's where I could see it myself as my own family, my kin, as well as not my direct family, but the kin, the neighbours is a word we've been using, that people were willing to make funerals happen, that observed the rituals through a collective activity that kept other people safe, and that it didn't come from top down. And it's something that we have in Ireland that we have as a cultural heritage, actually, that level, and that shouldn't, that I'm hearing that throughout today. So And I presume we'll hear more of it with the GAA coming in. But I just wanted to thank you for that, that it's wonderful to see it put in within the local context as well, and the critique of the everyday life experience that's so important to us all as well, and to hold on to that, Anyway, sorry, that's a long comment.
Thank you. Just to say that one of our panelists, Professor Sutra, has to leave us now, so I'd like to thank her for her participation. She has to leave a little bit earlier, and we just have another few moments, I think, We're out of time now. So I'd like to thank you all for your participation, and indeed to thank our panelists.